So I'd like to talk a little bit about the premise of the book and just a few more details about the book, and then talk about my past year. I've had a pretty terrific year. I had that moment where you get to quit your job and go do the things you really want to do, which is a really wonderful thing to do. And then I would love maybe a brief reading and then some question and answer, if that's okay. So this whole project actually started, you kind of backtrack a little bit. The novel itself, for those who haven't read it, is about this global event in which people's loved ones who have passed away have suddenly begun returning. And it centers on this couple, Harold and Lucille Hargrave, who are in their 70s, and they go to the door one day, and their 8-year-old son, who drowned almost 50 years ago, is at the door, still 8 years old, just as he was, still young and still vibrant. And it's happening not just for this one small family, but for people all across the world. So all around the globe, people's loved ones are returning, and people are really trying to figure out what it means. Are these really the loved ones? Are they something else? And so there's a lot of questions being raised by it. So that's the basic premise of the novel. And so it all started with a dream that I had. Both of my parents had passed away, my mother in 2001 and my father in 2007. So in the summer of 2010, I had this dream that I came home from work and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me. And so I came in and sat with her, and for what seemed like hours, we sat and just talked about everything that had happened in the years since she passed away. I talked about going to school, trying to be a writer, new people that I had met. She gave me a hard time for not being married, because that's what your mom kind of does. So it was this really wonderful thing where for the first time in almost a decade, I was back with my mom again, and it felt really vivid and true. And I woke up from it really expecting to find her still sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me, and of course she wasn't there. So the dream stuck with me for weeks, and I talked to a friend about it later. And at some point in the conversation, he said, wouldn't it be really amazing if that really happened, and what if it wasn't just her? And so that's kind of where the project actually started. I wrote a short story centered around this idea of this couple whose son returns and the effect that it has on people. And went to a reading, read it, people responded really strongly to it, so I felt like I had something. So I spent about a year working on the manuscript. And when it was done, I sent query letters out to a few agents. And at the time, while this was going on, I was working at Verizon Wireless customer service, so not a very glamorous job at all. Just answering cell phones, for people whose bill was too high or who had lost their phone or whatever, which is a kind of wacky job in and of itself. I've got a lot of strange stories from that job. One free tip to anyone that has a cell phone here, if you're having an affair, customer service cannot help you hide that affair at all. You get that phone call at least 3 times a week. That's just how it happened. So that was kind of the nature of the job. And so in 2011, I sent some query letters out and didn't expect them to go anywhere. This is probably my 5th or 6th manuscript, and the others hadn't really gone anywhere. But I write for the love of writing. And so I found an agent in about a pretty quick time. I got rejection letters first. I got about 9 or 10 rejection letters. There's still a couple agents I haven't heard back from yet. Who knows? And then I managed to get an email from the agent who said they sounded interested in it. So I sent her the manuscript. She read it over the course of a month or so and got back to me, and she said, well, there's 2 things we need to talk about first. She says, first of all, your title is pretty horrible, because the title at the time was Alive in Arcadia, which I still think is a pretty cool title, but whatever. The Return is much catchier, so we decided to go with that. Eventually we came to that one. And then we also had to rearrange the last 4 chapters, because my agent's a very hands-on kind of agent. She's very editorial. So if she sees something she feels is not quite working, she kind of wants you to actually work on it and build it. So it was kind of a shock to have to think you had to redo your entire work, but that's part of the process. So we spent a few months working on it, and we kind of worked because they're actually buying seasons in publishing, which I never knew. Most manuscripts are bought in spring or fall. So winter and summer are kind of just off seasons for publishing, which is kind of weird. So we spent the winter working on the manuscript, getting it better and better, trying to make it as best we could. And on May 10th, my agent sends it out to all these different publishers, about 10 or 11 of them. Random House, Doubleday, all these really big literary publishers, send out to them. And so I spent the whole weekend having panic attacks and freaking out because, your manuscript's out in the world, so you're waiting to see what happens. And my agent had told me, she says, it can happen quickly, it can happen slowly, it can never happen at all. You never really know what the stakes are going to be. So that was on Thursday. She sent it out. On Monday, I was at work. She gave me a call, which my agent never does because I hate talking on the phone because I worked at Verizon Wireless for 4 years. I'm literally that guy where if someone calls me, I will watch the phone ring and then text them back and say, hey, did you just call me? What's going on? Because I just don't like talking on the phone. And so she calls me and she goes, hey, are you sitting down? And I said, no. She goes, well, sit down for a moment. We need to talk. So I sat down and she goes, we have a preemptive offer on the book from Harlequin. And my first reaction was, do they read it? Do they know it's not a romance novel? Because it's Harlequin. Harlequin does bare-chested guys on the cover with their hair blowing in the breeze, and I didn't want that to be my book. But she explained to me that Harlequin has an imprint called Mira, and their job is to do literary fiction, non-romance kind of things. And they were really excited about the manuscript. They had gotten it on Thursday. My editor read it on Friday, sent it to her boss on Saturday, who sent it to her boss on Sunday, who had an emergency meeting Sunday night. Like, as a writer, that's what you dream of. You dream of a publisher who is just over the moon about your project, because that's when they'll push the book, and it just works out better for you. And so we had this discussion. This was Monday. My agent and I were talking, and she specifically says, she goes, don't quit your job. She goes, because it's just an offer, and it wasn't enough to get rich off of, but it was enough to quit your job, which honestly was really all I was shooting for. It's like the bare minimum, all I wanted. And so my agent goes, don't quit your job. She says, there's still things to be worked out. It's just an offer. We haven't made a deal, haven't agreed to anything yet. And I said, okay, cool, not a problem. And she goes, even more than that, if we do take the offer, it can take as much as 6 months for the check to actually come in. So you'll need health insurance, you'll need income, all those things that you need in your life. And I said, okay, cool. So I hung up the phone with her and went straight to my supervisor, and I said, I'm going home. And he kind of asked what was going on. It's like, is there a family emergency or anything like that? And I said, hey, I'm just going home right now. So I walked out the building. I took Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday off from work to do phone calls, because the publisher, we started having these conversations, kind of hashing out the deal, seeing if they were really right for me. And they were really excited about the book, like I said. And so on Thursday, we kind of made the deal official. Did like a high five over the phone. Everyone was really excited. And Friday was like, I was going to work, and I was on the fence about should I quit my job or not. Because I had enough of a savings to kind of keep me okay for a few months in case it took some time for the check to come in. And more than that, I'm a really responsible guy. I'm not the kind of guy that quits a job on a whim. I've never done it before in my entire life. And so I was going up the building and getting in the elevator, and I really did not like this job. I cannot stress that too much, because you're talking to people who are angry at you all day for 40 hours a week. So I was going to my desk, and when I saw my desk, something in my brain said, you don't have to if you don't want to. And that was really all I needed. I took a right turn, went straight to my supervisor, and I said, hey, today's my last day. And he kind of goes, well, what do you mean? Like, what's going on? And I said, today is my last day. There's no other way to say it. I can say it in French or Spanish, but it's going to mean the same thing. I'm never coming back in this building again. So I went in at 10 a.m., and I was gone by 10:13 and have not been back, which is wonderful. So that in and of itself would have been pretty terrific. I'd have been happy with just that happening. But then what happened was, when my agent sent it to these literary agents, the publishers, she also sent a copy of the book to a film rights agent. And he kind of said, he read the manuscript, liked it, and said, we'll see what happens. So that was in May. In mid-June, I get an email saying, hey, ABC, NBC, Fox, and one film studio all want the project. So I was completely blown away by that. So we spent some time talking to these production teams. And Plan B Entertainment, which is actually owned by Brad Pitt, who I have not met. That question always gets asked. Have not met Brad Pitt. Really would love to meet him at some point. Would probably like to meet his wife even more, but it's a whole other discussion. And so we decided to go with Plan B because they've got a terrific history of doing book-to-film translations. I'd actually been a fan of their work for a long time. They did a lot of good. They're just really good at handling book to taking it to film. So I felt like they would be a really good fit for the project. Now, oftentimes, options for books happen a lot, but they rarely go anywhere. Oftentimes, what will happen is, if a production company or a movie studio has a project that's similar to your book, they'll option your book, put their movie out, and then give you your option back without actually doing anything with it. So that way your book's not competing with their project. That happens a lot. Or the alternative is it takes a long time. Plan B's latest movie, World War Z, took about 8 years from the time it was optioned to the time it actually shows up in theaters. So that's kind of what I was expecting. I was thinking a decade from now, maybe I'll actually see something happen with it. And so that was in July. In late August, they got a contact. I got an email saying, hey, they've got a writer for the show. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. A month later, they had a director. And then 2 months after that, they were casting. Like, things happened just really quick. And again, the book hadn't even been, the publisher was still we were still editing the book, still kind of fine-tuning the book. And they started casting in November. They shot a pilot back in March. And then in May, it went before the network execs. And I found out another weird fact about television, or at least network television, is that for the pilots, all these different pilots, about 150 pilots go before the networks every year. So ABC in particular had 160-some pilots come before them. And there's literally one executive who decides what gets picked up and what doesn't. So it's not like a body of people. It's just one person who kind of watches all these pilots and then picks out the ones that he likes the most. So there was a 2-week period where this exec's kind of watching them, and it was kind of like watching a basketball tournament happen. Because every night at about 10 p.m., this website would post the listings of the shows that were not getting picked up. So it's kind of like watching teams getting kicked out of brackets. You just kind of see these shows not making it. So for 2 weeks, you're freaking out, hoping the show gets picked up. And then finally, on the very last night, it was like Saturday, like 10:38, the announcement came out, and it said, ABC picks up Resurrection. And I was kind of like, what the hell is Resurrection? Then in fine print at the bottom, it said, previously titled The Return. I was like, oh, they just changed the title. So they had picked the show up, they just changed the title, and right now they're shooting in Atlanta. So things are kind of marching forward very, very quickly. It's going to be an 8-episode season set to air on March 9th. And it's just, I'm pretty thrilled about it. Like, they're doing a great job with casting. Omar Epps is in it, Kurtwood Smith, Francis Fisher, a really amazing cast. The showrunner is named Aaron Zellman, who worked on The Killing on AMC. So they're doing a really terrific job. And that's been my amazing year, actually. It's just kind of gone from answering phones and talking to New Yorkers all day to being on a book tour. And the book's out in 13 different languages, something like 17 different countries. It's kind of amazing, quite frankly. Okay, so this is still pretty early on in the novels, first couple of chapters. And as I mentioned, the novel centers around Harold and Lucille, who are in their 70s. And this event where these people have been returning has been going on for a few weeks now. And Harold and Lucille hadn't had their son return yet, but there's a discussion that they kind of have about it. And so we're going to talk about that. You're also going to hear me mention the man from the Bureau of the Returned. Because what happens is when the return actually return, they don't always come back in the place where they passed away. So someone who passed away in Baltimore could show up in South Africa, and you have to get that person home. So this bureau kind of gets formed to help get people home. That's the initial impetus for it. But as the story goes on, the role of this bureau and the purpose of it changes in a not so good way as the story kind of goes on. But at this point, things are still pretty new. So we're going to read a little bit about Jacob, what happened to him, how he passed away, his parents, and then the moment of the reunion. Jacob William Hargrave died on August 15th, 1966, on his 8th birthday, in fact. In the years that followed, townsfolk would talk about his death in the late hours of the night when they could not sleep. They would roll over to wake their spouses and begin whispered conversations about the uncertainty of the world and how blessings needed to be counted. Sometimes they would rise together from the bed to stand in the doorway of their children's bedroom to watch them sleep and to ponder silently on the nature of a God who would take a child so soon from this world. They were Southerners in a small town, after all. How could such a tragedy not lead them to God? After Jacob's death, his mother, Lucille, would say that she'd known something terrible was going to happen that day on account of what had happened just the night before. That night, Lucille dreamed of her teeth falling out, something her mother had told her long ago was an omen of death. All throughout Jacob's party, Lucille had made a point to keep an eye on not only her son and the other children, but on all the other guests as well. She flitted about like a nervous sparrow, asking how everyone was doing and if they'd had enough to eat, and commenting on how they slimmed down since the last time she'd seen them, or on how tall their children had gotten, and now and again, how beautiful the weather was. The sun was everywhere, and everything was green that day. Her unease made her a wonderful hostess. No child went unfed. No guests found themselves lacking conversation. She'd even managed to talk Mary Green into singing for them later in the evening. The woman had a voice silkier than sugar, and Jacob, if he was old enough to have a crush on someone, had a thing for her, something that Mary's husband, Fred, often ribbed the boy about. It was a good day that day, a good day until Jacob disappeared. He slipped away unnoticed, the way only children and other small mysteries can. It was sometime between 3 and 3:30, as Harold and Lucille would later tell the police, when for reasons only the boy and the earth itself knew, Jacob made his way over the south side of the yard, down past the ponds, through the forest, and on down to the river, where, without permission or apology, he drowned. Just days before the man from the bureau showed up at their door, Harold and Lucille had been discussing what they might do if Jacob turned up returned. "They're not people," Lucille said, wringing her hands. They were on the porch. All important happenings occurred on the porch. "We couldn't just turn them away," Harold told his wife. He stamped his foot. The argument had turned very loud very quickly. "They're just not people," she repeated. Well, they're not people, then what are they? Vegetable? Mineral? Harold's lips itched for a cigarette. Smoking always helped him get the upper hand in their argument with his wife, which he suspected was the real reason she made such a fuss about the habit. Don't be flippant with me, Harold Nathaniel Hargrave. This is serious. Flippant? Yes, flippant. You're always flippant, always prone to flippancy. I swear, yesterday it was what, loquacious? So today it's flippant, huh? Don't mock me for trying to better myself. My mind is still as sharp as it always was, maybe even sharper. And don't you go trying to get off subject. Flippant. Harold smacked the word, hammering the final T at the end so hard a glistening bead of spittle cleared the porch railing. Lucille let it pass. I don't know what they are, she continued. She stood, and then she sat again. All I know is they're not like you and me. They're. She paused. She prepared the word in her mouth, putting it together carefully, brick by brick. They're devils, she said finally. Then she recoiled as if the word might turn and bite her. They've just come here to kill us or tempt us. These are the end days. When the dead shall walk the earth, it's all in the Bible. Harold snorted, still hung up on the word flippant. His hand went to his pocket. Devils, he said, his mind finding his train of thought as his hand found a cigarette lighter. Devils are superstitions, products of small minds and even smaller imaginations. Now there's one word that should be banned from the dictionary, devils. Ha, now there's a flippant word. It's got nothing to do with the way things really are. Nothing to do with these returned folks. And make no mistake about it, Lucille Abigail Daniels Hargrave, they are people. They can walk over and kiss you. And I ain't never met a devil that could do that. Although, before we were married, there was this one blonde girl over in Tulsa one Saturday night. Yeah, now she might have been the devil, or a devil at least. Hush up, Lucille barked, so loudly she seemed to surprise herself. I won't sit here and listen to you talk that way. Talk what way? It wouldn't be our boy, she said, her words slowing as the seriousness of things came drifting back to her, like the memory of a lost son, perhaps. Jacob's gone on to God, she said. Her hands had become thin, white fists in her lap. A silence came, and then it passed. Where is it? Harold asked. What? In the Bible. Where is it? Where is what? Where does it say the dead will walk the earth? Revelations! Lucille opened her arms as she said the word, as if the question could not be any more out of brain, as if she'd been asked about the flight patterns of pine trees. It's right there in Revelations, the dead shall walk the earth. She was glad to see that her hands were still fists. She waved them at no one, the way people in movies sometimes did. Harold laughed. What part of Revelations? What chapter? What verse? You hush up, she said. That it's in there is all that matters. Now hush. Yes, ma'am, Harold said. Wouldn't want to be flippant. But when the devil actually showed up at the front door, their own particular devil, small and wondrous as he had been all those years ago, his brown eyes slick with tears, joy, and the sudden relief of a child who has been too long away from home, too long of a time spent in the company of strangers. Well, Lucille, after she recovered from her fainting episode, melted like candle wax right there in front of the clean-cut, well-suited man from the bureau. For his part, the bureau man took it well enough. He smiled a practiced smile, no doubt having witnessed this exact scene more than a few times in recent weeks. There are support groups, the bureau man said. Support groups for the returned and support groups for the families of the returned. He smiled. He was found, the man continued. He'd given them both his name, but Harold and Lucille were already terrible at remembering people's names, and having been reunited with their dead son didn't do much to help now. So they thought of him simply as the man from the bureau. In a fishing village outside Beijing, China, he was kneeling at the edge of a river, trying to catch fish or some such, from what I've been told. The local people, none of whom spoke English well enough to understand, asked him his name in Mandarin, how he'd gotten there, where he was from, all those questions you ask when coming upon a lost child. When it was clear that language was something of a barrier, a group of women were able to calm him. He started crying, and why wouldn't he? The man smiled again. After all, he wasn't in Kansas anymore. But they settled him down, then they found an English-speaking official, and, well, he shrugged his shoulders beneath his dark suit, indicating the insignificance of the rest of the story. And then he added, "It's happening like this, all over." He paused again. He watched with a smile that was not disingenuous as Lucille fawned over the son who was suddenly no longer dead. She clutched him to her chest and kissed the crown of his head, then cupped his face in her hands and showered it with kisses and laughter and tears. And Jacob replied in kind, giggling and laughing, but not wiping away his mother's kisses, even though he was at that particular point in youth when wiping away a mother's kisses was what seemed most appropriate to him. It's a unique time for everyone, the man from the Bureau said. Thank you. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. So that kind of sets the impetus for what the book is about. Questions. I'm a real big fan of question and answer. One in the back right there.
I am so excited to see you here. I just wandered in, but I started reading your book on vacation last week. Oh, okay. It's very well written, and I'm really enjoying it, but I'm also finding the part where I am now unsettling, because it's, talking about how we would react to this. Initially people are excited, and then people started getting really afraid. And so I just completed the chapter where the older gentleman came in and wreaked havoc in the school where people are, and so I don't know what happens next. But as I've been reading, I've been wondering, how is he going to handle this? How is the author going to handle, the initial reaction, and then kind of the movement to people starting to get into contact, just getting those emotions. The initial emotions are kind of jubilance and kind of apprehension, and then they're like, what do we do with these people? And they keep coming and keep coming. So how did you get there? What did you just kind of write and it just flowed, or did you have a sense of how you were going to develop the world's reaction to these new beings?
Sure. Great question. As I was working through the book, I'm a big fan of outlines. Like any project that I have for a novel, I do with a really big outline. So in the original outline, I just knew that, as people began coming back, I knew kind of where I wanted to end. I wanted to end on a very certain note, but the details of how I got there were very murky. And so as I was working on the book, I would actually go around and talk to friends and their parents and just try to get a broad demographic. And I was asked two very interesting questions. The first question I would ask is, how would you feel if someone that you cared about suddenly returned? And all across the board, the reactions were, I would love to have my mom back, my dad, my child, whomever it was. Everyone they talked about being very excited about this. And then I would ask, okay, imagine that 6 months later, is the feeling still the exact same? And that's kind of where the answers got really complicated, because people began to discover that after someone passes away and we move forward, we change in very dramatic ways. Like my mother passed when I was 22. I'm 35 now. That's a pretty big difference that happens there. So if my mom showed up now expecting to find the 22-year-old boy that she left, and here I am, a 35-year-old man now, there would be some friction there. And so as I talked about that with people, I began to find that they were once they thought about that in that regard, they would say, well, it probably wouldn't really be my mom or whoever it was. So their reactions began getting somewhat negative at times. Some people would say that, they wouldn't believe this was their loved one who had came back, because the dead don't come back. So they started to develop kind of just attitudes that were not friendly towards this group of people. And so once I kind of found that, I started fleshing that out more and making it just more dramatic in the novel, making it happen more. So it was a case where once you create that dynamic of some people believe in something, other people don't believe in something, the friction always kind of builds itself, quite frankly. So that's kind of where that came from.
Oh, congratulations on the book. I was excited to read a review of it this week, because I found it interesting that you got the idea after your parents passed away, because my parents have passed away, and after my dad died, it was 3 years ago. And I found myself having this daydream that I would just open the door and he'd be there. And so as soon as I saw the review of the book, I was like, oh, good, somebody took that idea and wrote a whole novel about it. I'm so excited. So I was glad. And then I saw you're coming to Baltimore, so I was excited. My question, though, was more about your writings. I noticed your other published books are poetry. And I was just curious about your relationship between poetry and fiction. And do you consider yourself more of a poet, more of a fiction writer, or both? So that was my question.
Sure. Great question. My background is I initially began writing in fiction. When I was about 13 or 14, well, before that, I grew up reading a lot of the epic narratives, like Beowulf, the Odyssey, the Iliad, epic poetry. And I got really in love with that. And then around 13 or 14, I stumbled upon John Gardner's Grendel, which is a retelling of Beowulf from the monster's point of view, which kind of blew my mind. I think all writers need another writer to give them what I call permission to write. And so for me, when I found John Gardner's Grendel, and the idea that you could take this pre-existing story that was such a baseline of the Western culture and redo it and make it completely different, gave me the permission I needed. So I started writing fiction stories about the Odyssey and like little characters there and things like that. And then as I went forward, when I was in my 20s, I found poetry to meet women. I readily admit that. That's how most guys find poetry. That's just how it happens. And it works, quite frankly, so there's that. But don't go to graduate school to do that, because that's an expensive way to do it. It's a very expensive way. If you go to graduate school for poetry to meet women, very expensive. I don't recommend that. So I got into poetry in my 20s. And then for me, because historically, and this is a very strange thing actually, that historically the split between poetry and fiction is relatively new. If you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh and Beowulf, which are the oldest texts in Western culture, or Gilgamesh is the oldest text in written word, period. It's an epic poem. And so narrative poems are actually the oldest form of writing. It's the 13 or 1400s when things began to split, and you had fiction here and poetry here. So for me, I think I still kind of run in that circle where a poem or a fiction piece, they're not too far apart for me. So I tend to go, do both. I think that as a writer, you learn more about all the genres of writing by working in other parts of writing. I just finished playing with a screenplay. I'm hoping to kind of see where that goes. And I learned dramatic amounts about dialogue by writing screenplays, because screenplays are about 85% dialogue. And when I'm working in poetry, I learn about how to be concise and how to say things in a very short, very terse kind of way, and that helps my fiction a lot. So I try not to qualify myself very much. Some people see me, because the poetry books got published first. So people see me as a poet turned fiction writer. If you go by the actual history of it, it was probably fiction writer turned poet. But I just try to see it as a writer, period, and where it kind of goes, it goes. That's just my personal philosophy.
Hi, Hurry again. Actually, I would love to know how many people heard Jason Mott on WEAA. Great, awesome. My question to you, Jason, is, and I hear a lot of fiction writers say that their characters talk to them, like they just like people. And so my question is, did your characters talk to you? Did you create them, or did they just kind of like emerge? So that I have a second part. Did you know how the story would end when you started it?
Character generation, characters do take on a life of their own, because as a writer, if you're going to do justice to any character, you have to pretend with all of your utmost energy that this is a real, honest-to-God person. And so you have to give them their own motives. So what happens initially is you have a rough sketch of who a character is, and you start putting words into their mouths, and start making them do certain things. And then after a period, it's like the momentum gets going, and the character begins to speak for themselves. So I would get to the point with all projects when you're working with a character long enough to where you can what that character would say at any situation that you're in. I'm like, okay, Harold would say this, Lucille would say that, and this is how they respond. So there definitely reaches that point where the characters begin talking to you, and you just kind of use that to develop the story as it goes on. As for like the arc of it, I knew kind of where I wanted to end. I didn't know specifically like ABC exactly happens, but I knew the feeling that I wanted to leave at the ending, which is oftentimes how endings happen first. You know what you want to leave your reader with. Now, how you leave your reader with that is the hard part. That's where the middle it gets really complicated. But I knew that I wanted to have it end in a certain way to where when the reader finished, when they closed that last page, they came away with a very specific feeling. And so the rest of the novel is just trying to gear everything up to where when you close that last page, you get that feeling that I'm kind of shooting for, which is probably the hardest thing to do, which is what makes the novel such a complicated task, because you have to basically, it's kind of like trying to use 300 and some pages to say one sentence and to make that one sentence really count. And that's a really hard thing to do. But so I knew where I wanted to end it, but how I actually got there took some time.
You started to shop around your work, or in a way it sounds like if the Post wrote an accurate article, you didn't really have to shop around, they found you. Could you talk a little bit about that? My own experience with it wasn't always pleasant, so I'd just like to know what you did to protect yourself. And then the other thing, I don't want me to treat you like a medium, but I've often had dead people talk to me. But the difference is I found that when I tried to talk back, they would disappear or move or leave. They would usually just give me whatever message they wanted me to have and move on. So I just wondered, what do you think is the difference in dynamic, or how did it work?
The first question, how did I shop around the book? That was for this book, it happened really quickly, which unfortunately it it makes it seem like the overnight success thing. But I always try to stress that like this is probably my 5th actual manuscript, and the others are varying stages of train wrecks. I readily admit that. But each one of those, at the time it was finished, I thought it was good, and I shopped it around. And it's a process of sending out query letters, waiting to hear back, oftentimes never hearing back, getting rejection. And there really isn't any way around that. Like, the rejection letters are all part of the game. And it's not that the industry is trying to be cruel or anything of that matter. Agents aren't trying to be mean. It's a case where agents literally get about 3,000 to 4,000 emails a month, if not more than that, of people pitching them books. And so when you've got a stack of 4,000 people, you start sending out form rejections because you don't have time you can't contact every person. So it becomes a case where, in a certain extent, it's almost a numbers game. But at the same time, you have to really make sure your query letter stands out. There's so many things that you have to kind of learn how to work on when you start approaching agents or trying to find someone. As far as how I protected myself, I think that the industry isn't quite as... There are definitely people out there looking to take advantage of young writers or new writers, but they're the exception. They're not the norm. I know that the stigma around agents and the industry of publishing is that everyone's trying to steal your idea and make stuff happen. But the truth of what I found is that they're really just people who are excited about books, and they're always looking for new and exciting books to work with. And so I just sent query letters out, and with the query letter, all you do is you give the summary of what your book is, so you're not really giving away anything. So that's maybe one way to protect yourself as well. And also, with copyright laws, once you've written it, it's yours. It's copyrighted. If you got a copy on your hard drive, you got a paper version, it's yours. So as long as you've got that evidence, you're covered. There's really nothing to worry about there. As far as like the medium aspect of what happened with my mom, I think a lot of that came from, was it a spiritual visitation? We can always toss a coin on that. But there was also a certain layer of kind of personal things I had to work through, personal guilt maybe from her death, because when my mother passed, I was 22, young, kind of invulnerable. You get that feeling of it. And I didn't think that she would pass away. There was a moment when I had a chance to go to the hospital to visit her on the last day, and I didn't take it. Then all of a sudden she's gone, and that kind of stuck with me for years and kind of colored my future going forward. So I think for me that dream was just kind of a culmination of a lot of different things. Do I also think maybe she's kind of still helping me along? I can go along with that, definitely. So we'll see.
My question is, your book now is this property. It goes into the industry for the masses to take on. How curious are you about getting involved in that process? And is there any thought right now for you putting on the director's hat?
Not right now, honestly. Right now, because with the television series, I don't have any direct control, any direct involvement, and I actually like it better that way. Because what happened was when we made the deal with Plan B, we had a few initial conversations about where the show could go, like consulting stuff. What about this character? What about this idea? And we worked out a few things. But then they reached a point where they wanted to get their own writers and kind of get their own momentum going. And I also had another manuscript to do. It was a 2-book deal, so I owed my publisher another manuscript. So my plate was pretty full with that. Even more than that, being a showrunner, like organizing a TV series, is a very complicated job, and it's not the job that I want. I want just to be a writer. So as the show goes forward, hopefully you're gonna run for season after season after season. I would love to get in, perhaps writing an episode or 2 here and there, just 1 or 2 episodes. Because like I say, writing, I'm a big film and television junkie. I really love the medium. I would love to contribute to the conversation by writing some stuff for it. But I don't want to become a director, I don't think. I don't think that's where I want to go right now. 10 years from now, who knows how life develops, but right now I'm focusing on just becoming a better writer and learning to write different venues and things of that matter. So for right now, I don't want to direct. I'll let the show do its own thing.
I wanted to know, now that you have met your goal and you're refining your goal and living your dream, have your friends remained? Have they been supportive? Did you need to drop some friends, and have they been replaced? How has your life changed, your personal life changed with your friends and family? How has this affected them?
Sure, that is a very big question right there. My life has changed dramatically in the last year in ways that I never anticipated. Some ways I kind of expected, other ways I never anticipated whatsoever. It's really been the most tumultuous highs and lows of my entire life. I have people who we were very good friends before the success started happening. Now we really don't talk at all. I don't know what changed, but we don't conversate at all. But fortunately, there are about 7 or 8 people who I met in college, and we've always been really tight with each other. to where we're still as tight with each other. So on the day the book launched, to kind of give perspective on it, on launch day, I went and slept on my friend's couch in Chapel Hill, and it was just because I live in southeast North Carolina, down by the coast. So Chapel Hill is about a 4-hour drive away, and there were all these things I needed to do that day, on book launch day in Chapel Hill. And so I called a couple people around. I was trying to find places to stay, and some people were like, "Oh, you're famous and rich now. Go to a hotel and just stay there." And so it was like, well, I would just rather stay with friends if possible. And I called one of these friends from college, and I said, "Hey, is there any way maybe I can like crash on your couch? I'm trying to find a place to stay." And he goes, "Well, I got a couch you can stay on." And I was like, "Well, that sounds perfect." So that night, I just stayed. I slept on his couch. We set up, and ate pizza, and watched bad movies, and drank beer, and it was just like old times. So those people are still just who they are. I've got a lot more cousins all of a sudden. Yeah, just people 18 lines down there in a relation. Oh, cuz. I've got those people. I've got, ex-girlfriends who want to get back together now. So it's definitely a weird, strange dynamic that, just doesn't kind of let you sleep. So there's a lot of weird stuff that happens, but overall, one thing I'm learning is everyone has weird things happening in their life. No matter what status they're at, life can be rough and weird. So I'm just kind of moving through it day by day. It's definitely fun, but it's also weird. So it is what it is.
My question is, I read it as an ARC, but I remember being handed it as an ARC and already told that it had been optioned. Do you wish the process had evolved differently? It's exciting, but...
It is exciting, but honestly, I don't know, because the fact that it was optioned so early actually helps the book. It's one of those weird things where, like, if your book does well, that helps your career, which helps you on down the line. And so the book being optioned, especially by Brad Pitt's film company, that helped tremendously. I will readily admit that, because people think I know Brad Pitt. They think we hang out on weekends. And that helps people be interested in your book. So if it, would I have liked to evolve differently? I honestly don't know. There are certain things that I wish I had happened more slowly, because it has been a case where I haven't had time to adjust to everything yet. Like, it's just been so fast that dust hasn't settled on a lot of things yet. So would have maybe going more slowly would have been better, but at the same time, you kind of have to take life as it comes. And I could be back at Verizon where I was answering phones right now. This is the better of those two options. So if it comes with some rough stuff, then so be it.
It's kind of similar to what you were just talking about, but dealing more with the novel. Was there anything that you had to leave out or pull out, or any kind of pressure from the publishing company to say, hey, we don't know if we should have this in there, it's not commercial enough, the usual type of thing where they kind of say, hey, that's a little too out there or a little too serious?
With publisher, there's a fine line between commercial and literary. You're trying to find that balancing act. And I am inherently, it sounds weird, but I kind of like dark stories. I'm a big fan of the Coen brothers, like No Country for Old Men. There Will Be Blood by Paul Thomas Anderson. I love movies that are like that, really dark and fairly violent. And so my editor, she's good at kind of pulling me back off of that a little bit, saying, okay, we can't have this scene happen. It's just way too rough. And then there were also a scene where we struggled on answering questions. Kind of like this young lady here has a few questions. Because I will readily admit that there are certain questions in the book that do not get answered. And my editor and I and the publisher kind of went back and forth on, okay, which of these do we leave unanswered and which ones do we really have to answer for readers? So there was a little bit of that going on. We found some compromises going through that. So there's definitely things that were taken out, things that we had to put in later, definitely compromises that were made that were to where the book is a perfect fit between my original vision. It still stays true to that. I just kind of had to throttle back on some of the R-rated scenes or things of that matter.
Quick question, I just thought of it. Tom Perrotta wrote a book that was almost the opposite of yours. Where,
The Leftovers?
Yeah, The Leftovers. And I wondered what you thought of that. It's the people just disappear and never come back, whereas yours, the people come back and no one knows what to do with them. So I wonder if you read it and what you thought of it.
I love that book, actually. I hadn't read it before when I wrote this book. When I wrote this book and I found my agent, she was like, oh, you got to read this book by Tom Perrotta called The Leftovers, which is the opposite of your book. So in Tom Perrotta's book, The Leftovers, people just suddenly disappear as opposed to suddenly returning. So there's actually just the inversion of that. I think it's really weird. There's this almost like a little movement now, this idea of this spiritual kind of writing that's going on right now, which is very cool to be a part of. But yeah, I read it, and I did like that book a lot. I think Tom Perrotta is a great writer. I do recommend it to anyone looking for that kind of book. It's a very fun book.
You mentioned mentioned that you got a 2-book deal, and I've heard other authors talk about that as well. It seems fairly common. And I'm wondering about that second book, is that a great opportunity, a lot of pressure? How does that work?
It is both, honestly. It is wonderful to have a publisher, who believes in you enough to think you've got another book in you. They want to kind of, keep you on the leash for that, on the line for that one. But it does present a lot of pressure, especially if your first book does well, then everyone expects your second book to be even more better. And, it's the sequel, the curse of the sequels. But the second book, by the way, is not a sequel. But it is a case where there is a lot of pressure for the second book. But at the same time, I've always been my harshest critic. I always have tons of pressure on myself to begin with. So all the other pressure that goes on, that doesn't really bother me because I'm already worried enough about the second manuscript to begin with. I've adopted this policy of, I'm actually a very private person, and this whole being in the spotlight thing freaks me out. But the byproduct of that has become that I don't read reviews of the book, even good ones. I don't read reviews. I don't look at sales rankings. I don't look at sales numbers. I really just try to focus on the work at hand and being a writer. So right now I'm working on the next manuscript. Actually, my editor and I are already starting the early stages of editing on it. But it's a wonderful opportunity, but for some writers, it can chew you up and spit you out because you have to do it. Trying to promote one book and write another book is insanely difficult. I don't recommend anyone doing it. I probably won't do it this pace again. It'll be a slower pace next time. But at the same time, it keeps you in the rhythm and keeps you moving, and it kind of actually helps your career to be able to do it because your publisher's like, oh wow, he can do it again. That's terrific.
Is it just going to be where you think it's going to be continuing writing the novels, or do you think you're going to kind of intersperse it with some poetry, or?
Sure. I think honestly, my career hopefully will kind of evolve into a lot of different projects. The next book is another fiction novel, and it kind of, to me, thematically is similar to The Return. It's another small town in which something very unique has happened, and people respond in very different ways. So to me, it kind of reverberates with The Returned. After I finish this novel, I just finished a screenplay. I'm actually toying with that. I want to see if I have the chops to make that happen. And if this screenplay is terrible, which it probably is, I'll just keep working in it until I do another one. But I've got 2 other novels in the back of my head that I want to go to and work on. I would love to get into comic book writing. Neil Gaiman is kind of the template for what I would like my career to become. Because I think Neil Gaiman really adopts the idea that a writer is just a writer. You're not confined into any specific genre. So Neil Gaiman writes fiction, nonfiction, comic books, screenplays, television, children's stories, you name it, poetry, song lyrics, you name it, Neil Gaiman can write it. And that's something I really admire. So for me, hopefully you'll see a lot of different projects, but definitely another novel, definitely multiple novels in the years to come, but hopefully other things as well. Television maybe, screenplays, things of that matter. So hopefully diversity.
How do you plan to answer the questions that are left unanswered from this book?
Part of my writing philosophy, every writer has their own philosophy that they write towards. And my personal writing philosophy is that it's the job of the writer to start a discussion. And you can't start a discussion if you actually lead the discussion. My idea with the book is I want to have a book when people finish, they actually have something to talk about. So there are certain questions that people will ask me, well, how did you feel about this? And what's your stance on this? Where if I answer those questions, it actually directs the discussion. It doesn't allow people to discuss it on their own. Because then someone will say, well, the author himself said this is what he really wanted to happen. This is what he really thinks. So it must mean this. So there are questions that will not get answered. And I've had interviewers and I just flat out tell them, nope, I don't answer that question. And it's not because I'm doing it to be coy or to kind of, spark any kind of weird stuff. I just really believe that once you write something, it should leave a discussion open. And if I give answers to certain questions, it closes that discussion, and I don't want to do that. So certain things will not get answered. Cool. Well, thank you guys for having me. It's been awesome. Thank you.